And welcome back, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. And as you know, to be able to explain, defend the faith, you need to know some history. And so I love it when we can dig deep into history. And one of the areas of history that is often brought up, even I think especially in high school classes, public high school classes, is the dreaded Dark Ages and how the Western civilization was under the dominion of Catholicism and religious superstition, and nothing good came from this age. But actually, all of that's pretty much bunk because there's a lot going on. And to help us explain that, we have our author today, who is Philip Campbell. Philip is an author of several books, including Story of the Church and the 4-volume Story of Civilization series. He has also contributed to and edited a number of books and wrote 2 history textbooks. He's an instructor at Homeschool Connections and previously served 2 terms as mayor of Howell, Michigan. And Philip Campbell, welcome to Hands-on Apologetics.
Hey, Gary, I'm glad to be here with you today.
Yes, it's finally it's great to talk to you. We're both teachers for Homeschool Connections, and I always hear great things about your classes from my students.
Oh, good. I hear great things about your classes too. It's an overall great organization to be affiliated with.
Yeah, it definitely is. And for anyone interested, by the way, I'll give a short plug. Just go to Homeschool Connection. I think it's homeschoolconnections.com. You can check it out for online classes. And Philip takes history to a next level. So if you're going to sign your kids up for history, definitely check out his classes. So it's great to have you on the show. I think this is the first appearance here. And
I think so.
Yeah, so where did the idea come from to write a book on the Dark Ages?
Well, Ave Maria Press, who publishes the book, they were... I think the original idea was from Mike Aquilina, who was putting together a series on church history. And I should mention my book, The Church in the Dark Ages, is part of a larger series from Ave Maria Press where different authors each handled a different epoch of church history. So Mike Aquilina put together the whole idea for the series. And then they got to the Dark Ages, and I think they were like, who wants to write about this? So they said, let's call Philip Campbell. They called me, and they told me, hey, we want to do this book on the Dark Ages. Do you have any interest in this? And I was like, oh, yes, I really want to have something to say about the Dark Ages because, as you mentioned in your intro, there's a lot of misinformation about this period in history. People don't even know why it's called the Dark Ages, I think, or whether that term's even accurate. I think it's like a big blank in a lot of people's historical consciousness. And I'm a student of medieval history. I love it. So I was like, this is right up my alley. I'll definitely take it. And so I just kind of threw myself into it with gusto. And then 8 months later, this book came out, and it was great. So it was kind of a combination of this vision of Ave Maria Press and Mike Aquilina and me just wanting to say everything I wanted to say about the Dark Ages. And unfortunately, I still didn't get to say everything I wanted to say. I wish this book was 3 times thicker than it was, but I think it's a good introduction for people who want to just kind of, get a layman's introduction to the period.
Yeah, and I know what you mean, and that's the most impressive thing about the book. I mean, besides the content, is that it really isn't very daunting. I mean, this is very accessible to the average reader. Lots of interesting biographies, and it's short and readable. Yeah,
but I think it's short and readable, but I think it really helps you dig into the important people and ideas of the period. So I really feel that it strikes that proper balance.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's begin, I think, with the most fundamental question. What is the Dark Ages? Where did that come from?
Well, it actually came from a Catholic historian, ironically, of the Reformation period, Cardinal Baronius, who was one of the great historians of church history. He was writing a comprehensive history of the church, and he commented on a period in the 9th and 10th centuries when he couldn't find very many documents, and he said that this age was a saeculum obscurum, which was a dark age. And he really meant it only in a very restricted way. He meant that he couldn't find a lot of primary sources, so he called it dark. But the name kind of caught on, especially in the Protestant Reformation, and was applied retroactively to the entirety of really the first half of the Christian era, like from the fall of Rome into the High Middle Ages. So it kind of got applied there, and then we move into the Enlightenment, it gets expanded even more. Enlightenment thinkers who were very, very much hostile to the historical Christian tradition, they basically applied it to everything from the fall of Rome up until, 1789, the French Revolution. Basically, the entire era of Christendom was one long dark age in their opinion. So today, I think people just sort of very generically use the term Dark Ages to refer to the Middle Ages in particular, but it's very inaccurate. If you talk to historians, the Dark Ages has a much more limited scope. It's really from the fall of Rome until maybe the Carolingian period in the 800s, maybe a little longer into the 11th century. My book takes it up to the middle of the 11th century, so it covers about a span of 500 years after the fall of Rome.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it starts off that we just don't have a lot of documents from the period, all the way to a kind of propaganda, where it's dark because it's evil, malevolent, ignorant. With the Enlightenment people. Yeah. This idea that it's dark because people are shackled in the chains of ignorance or something like that. Yeah. So, okay, well, let's kind of look a little bit at this period, beginning at the very beginning with the fall of Rome. What impact did that have? Obviously, it was a catastrophic impact, but what happened? Did Rome survive at all, or you could just pick up the story right there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that's been hotly debated over the years. Traditionally, it has been custom to talk about the fall of Rome, and then the Middle Ages kind of follow upon Rome's fall. Nowadays, historians debate, to what degree did Rome fall versus did it just kind of transform slowly and evolve into the medieval society. But regardless of whether Rome fell or whether it transformed, the circumstances at the time of the collapse of Rome were catastrophic. I mean, this society had existed and held the fabric of Europe together for 1,000 years at that time. Mm-hmm. It was all anybody had ever known. And the entire cultural and scientific and literary accomplishments of mankind were very bound up with the Roman Empire. So when that institution collapsed, you also see a collapse in everything else that goes with civilization, a collapse in the general state of knowledge, in scientific knowledge, in literature, in scientific inquiry, just in literacy in general, as all these new foreign groups move into Europe that are speaking different languages. Cities decline, urban life declines, things become much more localized and rural. There's no longer this great cultural unity around the Mediterranean. So society just gets fragmented. The standard of living goes way down, and the level of culture just goes way down compared to what it was at the height of Greece and Rome. And really the only institution that was flourishing during this time was the church. You see every other secular institution kind of going into decay, and then the church alone is really in the ascendancy. So a lot of the best things about the ancient epoch, about Greece and Rome, are going to be kind of perpetuated forward through the church as the church adopts Greco-Roman thought and philosophy to help it explain its theology, as the church preserves its literature or draws on its literary forms to explain theology. So the church really becomes a preservative, I think, and we really try to draw that out in the book, talk about the church's actual contributions to culture, not just preserving what was old, but actually making real innovations, actually, in many cases, going beyond what the Greeks and the Romans had achieved in certain areas. So I'm just rambling now. It's a big question. It's a big question. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's where the book starts off.
Yeah. Well, here's a question. At the fall of Rome, we often focus on the West, with the barbarian, hordes and invasions and so on. Was the fall also equally felt in the East, and or was it different in the East?
It was different in the East because in the West you have all these places being detached from the Roman Empire and coming under Germanic rule. In the East, the imperial government managed to stave off the barbarian invasions and survived for another 1,000 years after reconstituting itself as the Byzantine Empire. But you're still going to have, I think in many places in the East, you still have that catastrophic sense just a few centuries later when they're taken over by the Muslim Arab invasions, in the 600s, places like Egypt and Palestine and so on. But, the core of the East in Greece and Asia Minor, they survive intact. So it's going to be perceived a little different over there. The intellectual and cultural traditions kind of carry on more unbroken in the East.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, that's something that always fascinated me, that ultimately that leads up to, the Great Schism, East and West, and, how we became disconnected, and most of the resources you find focus on the West, and after the collapse. So I always wondered what happened in the East and whether, obviously it was felt differently because they're under a different situation. But that's true though. Then you have the rise of Islam.
And the West and the East. Yeah, and over time the West and the East start seeing each other more with mutual hostility and suspicion. We know of the Great Schism that happened in 1054, which was like the definitive break between East and West. But what people forget is that leading up to that Great Schism, I don't remember exactly how many years, but if you look between like the year 400 and the year 1054, the East and the West were in a state of schism for many, many decades over that time. There was 4 or 5 different schisms that split the East and the West, and they kept like patching it back up. So it was kind of like there was a long process of detachment as as Western Europe just went in its own train of development.
Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Philip Campbell about his brand new book, The Church and the Dark Ages, put out by Ave Maria Press. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics.
This is a minute meditation from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
I am the bread of life. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat it and not die. John chapter 6 verses 48 to 50.
Saint Catherine of Siena once said, "How sad it is when those who have food before them let themselves die of hunger. Take your food, the loving Lord Jesus, who was crucified for us."
Dear Heavenly Father, let us never go hungry for spiritual food. Help us to receive your Son often, in Holy Communion, so that we may be brought together with you, in the union of the Holy Spirit.
This has been a minute meditation from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Here's a great way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Do you have an old car you want to get rid of, motorcycle, RV, or boat? Simply call 855-500-7433, and when they sell that vehicle, a portion of that money comes right back to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. It's an easy way to do it. I want to thank you for it. Call 855-500-7433. God love you and your family. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Michuta on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Philip Campbell, the author of The Church and the Dark Ages, put out by Ave Maria Press. A fantastic book. I highly recommend you pick it up because it deals with a lot of subjects that we run into in terms of apologetics. It has great short biographies of influential figures. And, one thing you tackle in your book, and this is kind of, it's interesting because almost from the word go, Christianity was made a scapegoat for, like, everything bad. Like, Augustine's City of God, he had to respond to the charge that it was Christianity that brought about, the raids on Rome, and then, things like that. The church caused a decline in education and literacy. But in your book, you show, no, that's not true at all.
Yeah, it's really not. It's not so much. It's not at all a case of the church causing a decline in these things. It's more a case of these things were in decline, and so where did individuals of intellectual talent, administrative talent, what outlet was left for their energies but the church? So in the book, one thing I mention is if you're an individual, let's say in the 1st century AD, right, in the time of Augustus Caesar, and you're literate and you're educated and you speak well and you have great organization skills and a lot of promise, what are you going to do with your life? Well, there's plenty of opportunities in the imperial bureaucracy to advance and to make something of yourself in the civil sector. But in the 6th century, those opportunities are all gone because the civil sector has completely deteriorated or has become non-existent in many places in Europe. The population is now all Christian, and in this age, if you're a young man who is educated and of good manners, good morals, you speak well, all the same talents, what are you going to do then? Well, the obvious outlet is that you're going to exercise those talents on behalf of the church, which is the only institution that's left that can accommodate that sort of that people like that can find an outlet for their skills. Not even counting the spiritual motives of wanting to serve God and pursue holiness, etc. So when people accuse the church of you contributed to the weakening of the Roman Empire by siphoning off, all the talent, it's really not the case. It's more that the secular civic spirit just kind of deteriorated to the point where the church was the only outlet left for those sort of people.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so
Gregory the Great, before he was pope, he was an important civil official, right, in the city of Rome. And then he ultimately determined, I'm going to serve God through the church. That's really where my calling is. You see a lot of that in the Dark Ages, where people are like, I'm going to serve God through the church. That's going to be a better way for me to live my life.
Yeah. And one thing that is very interesting, and you can see God's providence at hand here, is monasteries. Monasticism existed long before the Dark Ages, and it was just basically Christians trying to escape the worldliness of the cities, to grow in holiness.
Yeah.
But once the cities collapse in the Dark Ages, then the monasteries kind of become transformed.
Yeah, they become incubators, I think, incubators of culture, and not just in areas where, that had a long history of pre-Christian settlement, but you got to think of a monk. Monks want to be alone, right? They're always looking for, the monks are like, what's the most isolated mountaintop I can get to? Like, where's the most remote place in the desert? So a lot of these monastic founders, they go out into Europe and they think like, I'm going to go out into this remote forest and set up a monastery. I'm going to go out into these wastelands, and because they are these centers of education Most schooling throughout the Dark Ages was done in monasteries. They're where literacy is preserved and handed on. They become kind of cultural centers, and people settle around them, and they end up turning into cities. So you see in a lot of cities, especially throughout Northern Europe and Germany and places like that, these cities start as monastic foundations. Or a famous one is Kildare in Ireland, starts with St. Bridget going out and wanting to found a convent under the oak trees, and then people gather around her, and it turns into this big city. So they're actually responsible in a very direct way for helping to bring a lot of Europe under cultivation and found a lot of the cities that we now know of today.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And also with missionary activity, you also touch on that in the book as well.
Yes. I mean, this was the great age of missionaries, and not just missionaries, but monastic bishop missionaries. Most missionaries during the Dark Ages are monks, specifically of the Benedictine order, which is the only real order that exists at the time. Mm-hmm. And so you get individuals like Augustine of Canterbury or Saint Boniface or Saint Giles or any of these famous monastic missionaries who bring Christianity, but at the same time are bringing monasticism. The Christianity that is introduced throughout Europe is Christianity as introduced through the Benedictine order. And so the acceptance of Christianity is always going to come with the founding of monasteries and the establishment of monasticism in those places. One of the first things that Augustine of Canterbury does once he wins the approval of King Ethelbert of Kent is the king gives him some land at Canterbury, and he right away sets up a monastery there. So it's like the spread of the faith and the spread of monasticism go hand in hand.
Yeah. That's it's odd because, like I said, monks don't like being around people, right? They prefer to live in community, gated off. But yet you have these great missionaries, and what do? They form communities outside of the normal stream of things.
Yeah, it's the great paradox of the Christian saint. You get the people who just you think of Saint Anthony of Egypt, who just wanted to be alone, and how did that work out for him in terms of his influence and legacy?
Yeah.
God has bigger plans.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you have the monasticism. How about technology? Was the Dark Ages technologically dead?
No, in fact, there were certain innovations made in the Dark Ages. They were simple innovations, but they were very important. For example, it was monks who started harnessing the power of water with water wheels, which proliferated throughout Europe during the Dark Ages and provided a reliable source of power for operating mills by rivers. One of the most important changes in technology during the Dark Ages was something very simple. It was the padded harness on the horse. Believe it or not, the Romans and the Greeks, for all their ingenuity, when they harnessed their horses, they put the harness around the horse's neck. So when the horse was straining, the harness would constrict its neck and make it difficult to breathe, which obviously wasn't good for the horse, wasn't good for agriculture. It was in the Dark Ages that they figured out, hey, let's put a padding on the harness and let's cross it over the horse's chest, over its breast muscle, so that when the horse strains, it pulls from its chest and it doesn't choke itself. And this little simple invention was of marvelous importance for getting a lot more productivity out of the land. And the monks were excellent at this, at figuring out how to become more productive. And this is due to the Benedictine rule, because if you think of the Benedictine rule, we all know the Benedictine rule is ora et labora, right? Work and pray. The monk basically has to divide all his time. He has to divide his time between working and praying, being in the scriptorium, copying, sleeping. So the monk has this division of time, and because of that, he has to be as efficient as possible, right? Because 6 or 7 times throughout the day, he's going to get interrupted from whatever he's doing to be called back to prayer, So the monks have to find a way to work their labor in the most efficient way. So you find monks doing all these innovative things, experimenting with getting like breeding the heavy draft horses of Northern Europe that are used in the thick clay-based soils of Northern Europe. That's a monastic thing. coming up with these improved strains of wheat that give off better yields. That's a monastic improvement. Coming up with all sorts of things. I mean, even stuff like Parmesan cheese, champagne, all these different innovations in technology and food and things like that. They all come out of the monasteries because the monks are constantly tinkering, trying to come up with the most efficient way to farm to fulfill that Benedictine vision of being self-sustaining and punctuating the day with prayer. So a lot of their contributions are anonymous. We don't know who exactly first said, let's put a padded horse harness on its chest, but that doesn't mean that they're any less important or valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you pick up any business book, the main themes will be increasing efficiency. And so the Benedictine order had already anticipated that by centuries, just in the division of work and prayer. Yeah, that's a fantastic insight.
Yeah, and it's really cool. We have a whole section in the book that talks about those technological advancements and monasticism.
Yeah, and they also formed networks too, communication networks between monasteries, so they shared the technology as well.
Yeah, the monasteries became, like I said, little incubators, but also centers of diffusion of this new technology. Because as we sometimes forget, monasteries weren't always just on their own. A monastery might have a lot of villages or farms that were under its jurisdiction, and so whatever was going on in the monastery would spread to surrounding farms or towns, and then kind of from there spread throughout society at large. So they really preserved things. It's interesting. They were preservative, but they were also innovative.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it's and of course the ability to reproduce text has a built-in redundancy, so that if the barbarians wipe out a monastery or an area, that work was already duplicated by other monasteries.
Yes, it was, and it was done very successfully. Like, you got to think, when we read today something like Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars or the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, we are not reading translations that were made right from the original ancient Greek or Roman text. We are reading translations that were copied by medieval monks and that survived only because of them.
Yeah, absolutely. We're chatting with Philip Campbell, the author of the book, The Church and the Dark Ages, put out by Ave Maria Press. More to come right after the break. Stay tuned.
The 2022 Spiritual Warfare Conference with Father Chad Ripperger, Kyle Clement, Dr. Dan Schneider, and Jesse Romero is now officially sold out for in-person attendance. However, for those who missed out on pre-registering for in-person attendance to this event, you will still be able to view the conference online, which will be available the following Monday. So please visit our website, www.catholicrc.org, and register for the online viewing. And you will have unlimited access to the conference recordings and be able to go back and listen to any of the talks at your own convenience. And thank you for your support.
Hey, Terry Rodriguez. I'm a monthly donor here in Phoenix, Arizona. Retired Phoenix cop. And I've met Jesse before, and I just want to tell you guys were on fire yesterday on the Terry and Jesse show. You guys are on fire. Went to bed thinking, man, what an unwinnable war. But when I got up, I listened to you guys. You guys are doing good work, man. Doing God's work, and keep doing it. I know it gets exhausting sometimes, but there's people out here that really need the inspiration and the evangelization that you guys are giving us. So my best to you. And I'm Eddie Rodriguez. I'm a monthly donor and proud of it.
buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands on Apologetics with Gary Michuta. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We are chatting with Philip Campbell, the author of The Church in the Dark Ages, and fantastic work. We were talking about the monasteries and so on. Another thing that takes place during this period is the rise of the papacy. At least the papacy seems to have taken on a new dimension than it had prior to the fall of Rome.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you already see this development even overlapping with the end of the Roman Empire, but after the fall of Rome, it becomes much more important. Now, I don't want to stress this too much because secular historians will make too much of this aspect of the papacy. But it is true that after the fall of Rome, the popes started stepping in and filling a gap that was left by the demise of civil government. So if you read through the letters of Gregory the Great, you'll read lots of spiritual stuff and lots of stuff pertaining to the government of the church, but you'll also find lots of things about him trying to coordinate grain shipments from North Africa to Italy. You find stuff about taxation, about maintaining civil order, and things like that, things that you would normally expect that civil authorities would be arranging. But the popes step in, and they kind of fill in that gap. So you have a growth in the temporal importance of the papacy, and this only becomes more profound after the 700s, when the Carolingians give a large swath of central Italy to the popes to be their own temporal holdings, which is the origin of the papal states. But you also see a spiritual growth of the papacy, where as Christianity spreads throughout Western Europe, you see these churches acknowledging the See of Rome as their spiritual mother. And in some cases, this was a very direct lineage. Like we talked about St. Augustine of Canterbury earlier. He was sent on a mission to England directly at the behest of the Pope. Or St. Boniface, who evangelized Germany, was sent directly by the Pope for that very reason. So sometimes there's a very direct missionary connection. But even when there wasn't, there was just a general consensus that these Western bishoprics, that the See of Rome was like a seat of final appeal, like a supreme court of the West, of the Latin Church. And that was more generally acknowledged as time went on. And the popes worked to promote this idea through practices like the granting of the pallium, where when a bishop took up when a bishop was installed in an archiepiscopal see, he could not begin exercising his office until he received the pallium, which was a vestment, a woolen vestment from the Pope, signifying that he was in union with the See of Rome. So the papacy kind of grows in temporal importance and also in its spiritual ministry through this period as well, until by the time we get to the end of the Dark Ages, the 11th century, the papacy is recognized universally and explicitly as the head and mother of all the Western churches.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's also during this period that I think you can't really understand the so-called Middle Ages unless you understand, this period of time leading up to it, because ultimately that whole there's this tension between the temporal and the spiritual that Gregory the Great shoulders and is passed on through his successors, that ultimately leads to tension with the investiture controversies and such like that. So you can't really understand later history unless you understand its roots here.
Right, like the investiture controversy you mentioned, for the first part of the Christian era in the Dark Ages, the secular and the spiritual authorities were very intermingled. You find kings and lords and emperors exercising a considerable amount of influence over the church. And then we get to the investiture controversy. The church, led by the reforming papacy of St. Gregory VII, pursues a policy of disentangling the church from the state. And so they're kind of trying to go against several hundred years of tradition to disentangle the church from the control of the state, and it's only partially successful. But you're right, there's a lot of these things from the High Middle Ages that you're not going to understand unless you have a grounding in the history of the Dark Ages. And so that's one thing. I think that's what really was important to me when I was writing this book. Was I was like, this is a period of history that people know very little about. I mean, we all know about King Henry, but who knows about King Wamba? Like we need to know about Wamba, and we need to know about all these other kings who contributed to the formation of Christendom during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one person that I think most people know by name but don't really understand the significance of is Charlemagne. What role did he have during this period?
Oh, immense. It's difficult to overstate his influence. But I will say from the church's, without even going into the political stuff of welding together the Carolingian Empire and, creating the first kind of cultural political unity in Europe since the fall of Rome, from a church perspective, Charlemagne and his family funded missionary efforts all over Europe. Charlemagne saw that the Christian faith was ideal for turning these warlike barbarians into peaceful neighbors. So they funded missionaries going all over the place, to Scandinavia, to northern Germany, to the Slavic lands, everywhere. Much of Europe was evangelized because the Carolingians promoted it. Also, liturgically, what I talk about in the book on the section on liturgy is it was the Carolingians that were responsible for the dominance of the Roman rite in particular. There used to be all these other rites around, Gallican rites, different localized rites throughout the West. The Carolingians preferred the Latin rite, and wherever they extended their territory, they pushed for the adoption of the Latin rite. So the reason, or I'm sorry, not the Latin rite, the Roman rite in particular, the rite of the city of Rome. So the reason by the time we get to the High Middle Ages that most of Western Europe is using the liturgy of Rome is due to the Carolingians. So just a lot of influence. It's hard to overstate it, but Charlemagne and his family were tremendously influential in shaping how Europe developed into the High Middle Ages.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and another thing too is, and you treat this in your book as well, this is also a period of time where there were Eucharistic controversies going on.
Oh, yeah. Now we have to be careful here because especially Protestants will frame this as like, well, in the early Middle Ages, they didn't believe in the real presence, and then suddenly they believed in it in 1215. I'm sure you've dealt with these sorts of objections in your apologetics work. And this is just not true. You find the word transubstantiation first used in the Lateran Council in 1215, but Christians had always understood that there was a real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And what the controversy was in the Dark Ages was how was he present? In what manner was there a real presence? They all understood that Christ was present. That was not being deliberated. If a Protestant would have gone back in time to the year 800 and said there's no presence of Christ in the Eucharist, then he would have been, run out of town. So everybody understood that Christ was present, but the question was it in a carnal way, or was it in some other way? And a carnal way would be the same way that any sort of physical meat and drink is present to me. Like when I pick up a steak and I eat it, I'm gnawing on, muscle tissue in my mouth, So people wonder when I receive the Eucharist, like, am I gnawing on the bones and the hair of the historical Jesus in my mouth, And that seemed to not resonate well with some of the church's theologians, and then others proposed a view that was more radical the other way and said, well, his body is to be understood in this kind of vague sense that's not his historical body, but that didn't seem right either. And what they were trying to work out was the concept of a sacramental mode of presence, a sacramental mode where Christ is truly, substantially, bodily present in the sacred species, but not in like a cannibalistic sense, you know.
Yeah.
And that's what they were struggling to work out. They were and what we see is when we get the High Middle Ages, when we get the emergence of Aristotelian logic that comes into the church's vocabulary, and now they can explain, yes, the substance of the body of Christ is there. It is truly and substantially Christ's real body, but the accidents have changed. So you're no longer having the accidents of his body, it's the accidents of bread and wine, right? And so it gives the church a vocabulary to describe how Christ can truly be present in a physical bodily sense, right? But not understood in a carnal sense, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very well put. You know, it's we didn't have the language that's had the precision to be able to describe it accurately. It's interesting that it appears so late in history too that theologians turned their attention to it. Any insight into why the discussion happened at this particular time?
I think so. I think it has to do with the growing interest in the science of logic in theological circles, because at the beginning of the Dark Ages, the ancient Roman and Greek studies of logic and rhetoric really just kind of fell by the wayside. And to be a theologian was simply a matter of knowing and commenting upon the scriptures. But then as we go through the Dark Ages, you get this gradual reintroduction of logic where people are much more interested in the precise definitions of words, right? And understanding, I guess, more a reintroduction of rationalism, you know, trying to get to the rational, logical meaning of words rather than just a purely faith-based approach. And so as that grows, there's going to be more dissensions and disagreements on what certain definitions mean. And these arguments force the church to develop more precision in its vocabulary of how we explain these supernatural mysteries. And it's only going to get more intense as you move into the High Middle Ages. I think it probably peaks, you know, in the 1100s and 1200s, like I said, with the rediscovery of Aristotle going to the age of scholasticism. But it was a great blessing because I think otherwise the church wouldn't have been able to explain a lot of these concepts in a precise, meaningful way. So I think it was one of those providential things that was reintroduced into the West at that time that really helped the church to formulate how to explain these mysteries.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where can people go to get a hold of a copy of The Church and the Dark Ages?
The easiest way is just go on Amazon and look up Church in the Dark Ages, Philip Campbell, and you can get it right there.
Awesome. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure. I should have you back on the show.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks.
All right. Philip Campbell, the book is The Church and Dark Ages. Very accessible, very interesting read. Pick it up if you can. Wow, I can't believe the hour has flown. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow. Do this thing we call Hands on Apologetics. Bye-bye, everybody.